Good evening. I'm Mariat Imaeva, legal consultant working at EHRAC. I'll be chairing the panel discussion. And we'll start with Akhmed Gisaev, who is a human rights lawyer and director of Human Rights Analysis Center in Oslo. As you saw in the film, he's featured in the film. He's helping out the relatives of the disappeared to find out the fate of their loved ones. He had to leave Chechnya himself. Before that, he worked with Memorial Human Rights Center, and once in Norway, he also worked with Norwegian Helsinki Committee. Ahmed, we saw you in the film, and you knew Mantas. If you can, could you say a few words about Mantas and how you got involved in making this film?
Так, начну с того, что поблагодарю вас за это мероприятие. Также поприветствуем всех, кто здесь присутствует.
I would like first to express my gratitude to organizers of this event and welcome everybody who's come to see it.
Что касается нашей встречи или знакомства с Мантасом, эта встреча, первая встреча, наше знакомство состоялось весной 2007 года.
As for the time I met Mantas for the first time, that was in spring 2007.
Мантас, предварительно позвонив мне с еще одним исследователем из Европы, они приехали ко мне в гости домой на Шекспир-стрит 23.
Mantas and another researcher called me and they wanted to come and see me at home. And my address at the time was Shakespeare Street 23 in Grozny.
Мы с ним в тот день поговорили довольно-таки долго, да. После этого у нас были еще встречи, и после этого, в принципе, Мантас жил у меня дома.
We've had more meetings on that day. We had a long chat, and after that, Mantas was staying at my home.
Я, в принципе, попытался погрузить Мантаса в действительную картину происходящих событий там в Чечне, да, потому что у меня был опыт и собственный опыт, вот, и так далее. И в процессе, значит, наших дискуссий мы пришли к выводу, что все-таки хорошо было бы вот эту трагедию людей, ну, именно насильственное исчезновение, что вынести это все и показать как бы всему миру.
So I was trying to explain to Mantas what was actually happening in Chechnya through my own experience, because I've been exposed to a lot of it too. And after some discussions, we've decided that we need to show it to the world to explain what it actually meant, the enforced disappearances.
Я имею в виду, под собственным опытом, я тоже был подвергнут похищению, пыткам, да, я выиграл это дело в Европейском суде, благодаря в том числе и EHRAC, который здесь присутствует, за что мы их поблагодарим.
What I'm saying through my experience, because I was also kidnapped and I was tortured, and I took the case to the European Court of Human Rights, and this was done with the help of EHRAC, which I'm really grateful to them for.
Вот, то есть после того, как мы пришли к выводу, что лучше было бы снять об этом фильм, я искал людей, у которых были, значит, пропавшие, насильственно исчезнувшие, значит, родственники, и мы начали снимать этот фильм.
So after it was decided to make a film about it, I started looking for the people whose loved ones disappeared, and we started to make this movie.
И, в принципе, все это происходило с 2007 года до лета 2009 года, когда мне пришлось покинуть Чечню, Россию и бежать оттуда просто-напросто.
And all this was happening between 2007 and 2009, summer 2009, when I had to leave Chechnya, leave Russia, flee from there.
And you used to work as Human Rights Memorial Center, and they have registered over 5,000 disappeared. The number might be actually much higher. Most of those have disappeared during the Second Russian-Chechen War, which was launched in 1999. Can you tell us, do you think that the use of this crime, is it a coincidence or is a deliberate tactic, a tool of war?
Так, что касается этого вопроса, я, в принципе, считаю, что я довольно хорошо проанализировал вот эти события, а точнее, насколько хорошо Россия, да, то есть российское государство, оно подготовилось именно к насильственным исчезновениям.
I believe I have analyzed this issue quite well, and what I've realized that Russia, the Russian government, has prepared to using the enhanced disappearances quite well.
Самым наглядным таким примером является то, что после одного года подписания мирного договора между Чечней и Россией в 1997 году, 12 мая, был принят так называемый за номером 130, по-моему, закон, который так и называется антитеррористическим законом.
And I believe the best proof to it is that after an agreement was signed between Russia and Chechnya in 1997 on the 12th of May, and I believe it was a decree number 103 or something like that, they prepared the decree to combat terrorism.
Сам процесс принятия вот этого закона немножко интересен, потому что я считаю, что он был принят очень быстро, довольно-таки форсированно, потому что, в принципе, он был принят за какие-то, я не знаю, там, ну, за три недели практически, да, то есть 3 июля, если мне не изменяет память, он был инициирован Госдумой, как вы знаете, парламент в России, он двухуровневый, да, то есть одобрен он Советом Федерации, да, и окончательно 25 июля он был принят.
And it didn't take long to adopt this law. I would say they forced the adoption because it only took 3 months for the draft to pass and to be adopted. And as you know, the parliament in Russia is a two-level one, so it went through both levels in a very short time.
Так вот в этом законе, именно в этом законе Россия за год до начала войны, российское государство предусмотрело все элементы, которые сопровождают насильственное исчезновение.
So in this law, a year before the war started, Russia envisaged all the elements that follow the enhanced disappearances.
И опять же повторяюсь, 25 июля 1998 года.
It was 25th of July, 1998.
Смотрите, в этом законе государство предусмотрело, что оно на объявленной территории, где проводится якобы антитеррористическая операция, там это государство предусмотрело, что оно имеет право задерживать любого человека по своему усмотрению.
The law provides for anybody in a designated area where anti-terrorist actions are taking place to be detained without any reason.
Да, там есть какая-то причина прописанная, да, но, в принципе, эту причину можно предъявить к любому человеку, который находится на этой территории.
Some kind of reason is identified there, but it can be applied to almost anybody who is in the designated area.
Второй элемент, который там был предусмотрен, это транспортировка человека якобы к месту задержания, то есть перемещение в пространстве.
And the second point that was included there was transportation of the person who is being detained to the point of detention.
Третий элемент – это содержание в усмотренном ими, то есть в том месте, где они считают нужным этого человека.
The third point is the detention of the person in a place chosen by them. So they identify where to keep this person.
И еще такой окончательный элемент, который они там предусмотрели, это значит захоронение человека, да, которого они называют террористом, без объявления места как бы погребения, то есть в тайном месте и без сообщения его родственникам.
And the final point was the burial the person who is recognized as a terrorist would be buried, and no information will be passed about it to any of the relatives or anybody else. So the place of burial is kept in secret.
Еще, значит, дополнительные элементы, которые они там предусмотрели, это проникновение, значит, в границы частной собственности и частного автотранспорта.
And in addition, private property and private cars could be broken into by this law.
То есть все это и дополнение к этому, значит, имена, фамилии, звания, там, проводящих якобы эту антитеррористическую операцию, они как бы тоже не разглашаются, они тоже остаются как бы в секрете, да. То есть все это было предусмотрено вот в этом законодательстве. И этот закон, и вот эта практика насильственного исчезновения, я считаю, что для российского государства именно в Чечне она была очень востребована, потому что именно с помощью этих насильственных исчезновений было подавлено в первую очередь гражданское общество, гражданское население. Я настаиваю на том, что этот закон и эта практика были в первую очередь направлены против гражданского населения.
In addition, the law provided for the names of the people who carried out the activities, the operations, to be kept in secret as well. So anybody involved in this so-called anti-terroristic actions had to be kept in secret as well. So I believe this law has provided all the conditions necessary for the enhanced enforced disappearances to be used as a tool. And this tool has been used widely in Chechnya, and most of all it was used to suppress the civil society.
И в дополнение я еще могу добавить, в принципе, если мы возьмем те же события, пусть мы сейчас поменяем географию, да, например, Украина, события в Украине, да, так с 2014 года вот все эти события в Украине, в принципе, вот их начало, да, в принципе, они как бы начинались именно с похищения, ну, например, украинских каких-то госслужащих, да, там, по-моему, депутат там был похищен, да, и так далее, и так далее. То есть это все применялось против гражданского населения, и там, и здесь.
And if we change geography and take Ukraine, for example, since 2014, enforced disappearances were used in Ukraine as well, and people were being kidnapped. As far as I remember, even a deputy was kidnapped there. So in both countries, the same tool was used in the same way.
Against civilians. We will talk with Tetiana about the situation in Ukraine, but before that, you said that it was used to repress civilians against civilians. What other impact, in your opinion, did this crime had on the population in Chechnya?
Could you speak up? It's you who's can't hear.
It's right in my. Maybe could you tell us about the impact of enforced disappearances? Can you hear me now? On the families and the population.
Ну, воздействие, оно, в принципе, я думаю, что они достигли своих целей. И цель этих исчезновений все-таки было подавить, как я сказал, гражданское население, гражданское общество, вселить страх, всепроникающий страх, который, в принципе, эту цель, я считаю, что они достигли.
The point of using enforced disappearances was to suppress the civil society and to make people scared, to spread the fear. And I believe they've reached this objective.
Thank you. Now we will switch to Tetiana. Tetiana is, as Jess said at the beginning, is head of Human Rights Center ZMINA in Ukraine. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, ZMINA has been documenting war crimes being committed there, including enforced disappearances. Tetiana, could you tell us about the use of this crime in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and for the possibility to speak at this discussion on this specific day, which is very important for human rights defenders and for many relatives who are still looking for their lovely ones. In Ukraine, a practice of the enforced disappearances started right after Russia occupied Crimea. And the first case of enforced disappearance was registered on 3rd March 2014, and Russia started its invasion into Crimea starting from 20th of February. So just in a week or a little bit more than a week, first victim was abducted. It was a Crimean Tatar activist, Reshat Ametov. He went to protest against the occupation to the Lenin Square, the center of Simferopol, and he was standing in the single protest, and later he was taken by 4 men, unknown men, and later in 2 weeks his body was found near the Mlyanichny village, not far from Simferopol. He was heavily tortured, and the reason of his death was that he was stabbed with a knife in his eye. After that, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission that works in Ukraine starting from 2014 documented 43 cases of enforced disappearances in Crimea. And these cases were registered from 2014, where the biggest number of the cases happened till 2018. 11 persons from this list are still missing, and as it is already years past, we are afraid that these people are not alive anymore. And speaking about the alleged perpetrators, there are strong evidence about the connection to many of the cases of enforced disappearances of the local militia group, paramilitary group, called Crimean Self-Defense, which was acting together with the occupying power, with Russian military. Needless to say that none of the cases was investigated by the Russian authorities throughout these years, but they were investigated, some of them were investigated by the Prosecutor Office of Ukraine. For example, the case of Reshat Ametov was investigated, and perpetrators were identified, even having the fact that Ukrainian prosecutor's office doesn't have physical access to the occupied Crimea, but it can conduct investigations and collect evidence. And then after it, Russia immediately started in 2014 occupation of the part of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, Donbass, and you maybe heard about the famous illegal prison called isolation, Izolyatsiya, where many people were taken and tortured, in many cases till death. So in Donbass, the number of enforced disappearances reached not several dozen of cases, but hundreds of cases. And as for now, due to the governmental data, we have 23,000 of enforced disappearances which were registered in the framework of the Russian armed aggression. And we clearly see that with every new circle of the Russian aggression, the number of victims is growing. So in Crimea it was 43 persons, then hundreds in Donbass, and now 23,000 and tens of thousands in the framework of the large-scale Russian armed aggression. And if we speak now about the trade of these people who are victims of enforced disappearances, there are 2 categories. First, these are people who are missing because they were targeted because the civil society activism and other group which is connected to military.
Thank you. So these targeted groups you mean mostly are civil society, people engaging in civil society work?
Yes. That's true. We saw it on the example of Crimea. Enforced disappearances unproportionally affected Crimean Tatar population, which are indigenous people of Crimea, and the majority of abducted people were of Crimean Tatar origin, including the first victim, Reshat Ametov, whom I mentioned. But this is not only ethnicity. If we look at what people did, mainly these were journalists, activists who were protesting against occupation, filmmakers, etc., etc. And this portrait also is a bit the same now after 24th of February. Our organization, the Human Rights Center ZMINA, has documented 562 cases of enforced disappearances of civilians, active members of the local communities. And among them, we have journalists, activists, school teachers, school directors, religious leaders, representatives of the local self-government, volunteers. So different types of people who were active at the local level, who were opinion leaders and who were visible, whose role was visible. For example, in accordance with our data, as I mentioned, it's over 500 cases, but it's not all the cases. It's just the cases that our organization was able to verify and document, conduct interviews. So out of these 500 cases, we have 323 persons who were civil society activists and volunteers who provided support to civilian population. 128 persons were representatives of the local self-government. These are city mayors, village heads, local deputies, or workers of the local self-government bodies. Also, Russians were abducting the relatives of the active citizens and trying also, if they cannot find the person, they took relatives, and 32 persons from this list were relatives. Also, as I mentioned, these were school directors, teachers of Ukrainian language and literature, Ukrainian history, those people who didn't want to transform Ukrainian curricula to Russian standards. And the next group, the next biggest group is journalists. 18 persons from the list of the people who were abducted are journalists. And out of these 562 cases, when we published our report, it was 2 months ago, 311 persons were still missing or were in Russian captivity, proved in Russian captivity. And 16 persons were found dead. Among them, Mantas Kvedaravičius, whom we were talking about.
And similar to Akhmed, I wanted to ask you about the impact of this crime on the families as well as population in Ukraine.
I think this impact has a double effect, and it's double paralyzing. First, when the person is abducted, it's a pain for the relatives because they are living day by day, month by month, year by year, between the hope and despair. They don't know when the news comes, and they might be waiting for this news for years, and news will not come. So in a way, they are imprisoned, they are entrapped together with those people who are abducted. And another victim is the whole society and communities, because this vast practice of abductions and enforced disappearances is done to terrify the local population and to break the resistance and resilience. And it is also in Ukraine, when Russians invaded, there were a lot of meetings, a lot of peaceful demonstrations against the Russian occupation under the guns of Russian tanks and troops. But later, when the active members of local community were kidnapped, were abducted, disappeared, this demonstration stopped. So we see that also it has a paralyzing effect on the local communities and on the society as on the whole. But Ukrainians are continuing to fight even despite these very grave circumstances and conditions. As I said, we have 23,000 of missing persons. Not all of them are victims of enforced disappearances, because some people can, for example, be missing because they were killed during shellings, etc., etc. So those cases that we connected are the cases where we have the signs and proofs that people were taken by the Russian agents, Russian forces.
Thank you, Tetiana. Would like now to turn to Sarah, who is head of clinical services for Trauma Treatment International, which is an organization providing evidence-based treatment to trauma-affected people. And Sarah, you are a clinical psychologist with specialization in psychological consequences and treatment in the areas of human rights trauma. I have two questions for you, which are interlinked. So, could you explain to us the difference between the crime of enforced disappearance and other crimes in terms of its impact on the families, and also tell us what is needed for them to have closure and to move on?
Thank you. I have made a lot of notes, and there's lots that I want to say and could say, but I'm going to talk as quickly and clearly as possible because I know we don't have lots of time. I guess it would be helpful for me to share my understanding of the psychological impact that enforced disappearances has, and I think the film did such a brilliant job at portraying the experience of ambiguous loss and how the difficulty people have coping with uncertainty. And I think this is the biggest assault on the human mind in the act of enforced disappearances. That kind of loss and uncertainty is experienced as a type of threat by the families. It's a psychological and emotional threat that their loved one is being tortured or has been executed, is not coming home. When we experience a threat like that, our body goes into that state of fight-flight, which I think most of us will be familiar with. In fight-flight, we are given the energy to mobilize, and that really means to be able to respond to what is happening, to either get away from the threat or to reduce it or stop it. And in this context, it means, how do we create certainty? How do we get answers? How do we help our family member to come home? And we saw in the film people making phone calls, writing things down, and those more kind of culturally nuanced behaviours of visiting fortune tellers. The difficulty with enforced disappearances is two things. For the vast majority, those mobilising efforts are futile. And the second thing is that stress and that threat is chronic, lasting for years and years and years. So the body and the mind are experiencing that this is a threat that is not going away. I have no control, and it is overwhelmingly painful. And in that situation, the body has this adaptive response. The medical term is a dorsal vagal shutdown, but we often refer to it as that frozen state or that dissociated state, so clearly portrayed in the film. And shutdown is the body's way of helping a person to cope with a threat that is not going away, but feels incredibly painful. And it does this by disconnecting the person from reality. The brain stops functioning as it normally would, and there is a complete slowing down of all biological functions, so things like digestion, breath, immunity, hormone production. And in some of the extreme cases, we might see things like fainting, and we had the lady explaining that in the film, or a catatonic state. And I think we saw that in a film as well, people sort of looking like statues. And in some cases, there's a cutting off the vocal capacity and people become mute. When people are living from that dorsal vagal shutdown state, time is also experienced as frozen. And I think that's really important when understanding part of the traumatic impact of enforced disappearances. Time does not aid healing in this context. That stuckness means that the trauma remains new or raw, and it feels like it has just happened, not something that happened maybe 6, 7, or 8 years ago. I think the other way to understand the impact and that frozen state that we saw in the film is the function of hope. And this is a really complicated and sensitive but really interesting topic in these types of contexts. If we understand that uncertainty is one of the driving forces of the traumatic impact for families, hope does not create certainty. I think it prolongs the experience of trauma, and it prevents people from developing and engaging in behaviours and strategies that could help them to cope with some of what they are experiencing. And it is really hard to hear that, because we have this universal notion, don't we, that hope helps us to endure suffering. But that's not what I tend to witness in my work with people who are victims of these types of human rights abuses. And I think what's even harder is that you have a small number, particularly in this community, it sounds like, of people that do come home. And every return should be celebrated, but the cruel reality of this type of human rights abuse is that every homecoming and every release prolongs the trauma of others. My abnormal heart rate going here for some reason. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because when we see someone coming home, we start to believe that the same can happen for us. And when we believe that for ourselves, it feels like the best thing to cope with not knowing when that person is coming home, the fact that we can't do anything about it, the incredible pain that we feel as a result, the best thing to do is shut down, to not plan, to not move forward. And I think that's also an adaptive strategy for an imagined feeling of guilt that people have. What is going to happen if my loved one does come home in 10 years' time and they see that I have moved on? How is that going to be perceived? How is that going to be perceived by the community? So I think it's another thing that keeps people stuck in that frozen state. One thing I also wanted to mention was the presence of nightmares. Enforced disappearances is very similar to contexts that I've been working in more recently, like the Yazidi community. A lot of the mothers there were having nightmares to their imagined torture and abuse that their sons and their daughters were experiencing at the hands of ISIS. And it was those nightmares that actually triggered PTSD, not the abduction itself. In the film, we didn't really hear much about those types of nightmares. It was more about dreams or premonitions that had a more positive affect. But I'd be interested to know if, in the context of enforced disappearances, those sorts of nightmares are present as well. And the other thing that really caught my attention was the children. And the reality of intergenerational trauma, which really means how the trauma of parents impacts the psychological health and development of the children. We know that from birth and throughout childhood, there are key psychological and emotional needs that must be met, regardless of how physically well looked after you are. And it's going to be really difficult for parents who are in that stuck state or experiencing ongoing trauma to be able to meet those psychological needs. And if those psychological needs aren't met, that child is going to be at high risk of mental health difficulties throughout the lifespan. So things like anxiety, depression, addiction, poor social functioning, poor educational and vocational attainment. And so when you have enforced disappearances impacting high numbers in the community, you can see the ripple effect that this has, not just on the individual level, but on the community level. If you've got a lot of people who as children were experiencing this trauma through the eyes of their parents, as adults are struggling with mental health, there are going to be much poorer outcomes socially, economically, politically. And then you're asking about healing and how we can help communities to, in some way, navigate what's going on. If we kind of agree that one of the biggest driving forces is uncertainty, then creating certainty has got to be one of the main things. So there are some clear necessary legal and humanitarian mechanisms needed. So, for example, being informed as soon as possible that your loved one has been killed. And then even after confirmation of death, being able to provide families with information about how they died and when they died, and other details of their enforced disappearance. The brain is a storyteller, and post-trauma there is an inherent need to have a complete story about what happened. Dates, times, what happened to the person, how it happened and why it happened. And without that full story, the brain finds it very difficult to make sense of the experience. It inhibits emotional processing, and the brain finds it difficult to put it away. So what happens is the brain gets fixated on trying to fill those gaps. It's constantly thinking about it. That keeps the experience raw, and it keeps pulling people back into the past rather than helping people move forward. I guess there's also other techniques that would help with that stuck, frozen state. I think education is a must within communities about the psychological impact that these sorts of experiences are having, and why the mind and the body moves into maybe this frozen state that we have seen. And moving away from more traditional Western medicine approaches, but to more somatic practices, which help people connect with the mind and body. So things like movement, music, chanting, meditation. And I really like those practices because it really can lean into the cultural and spiritual nuances of the community that you're working with. And then I guess something about intergenerational trauma. Again, how do we interrupt that process? How do we help communities, family members to talk about enforced disappearances with children? How do we bolster support for children within the communities as well?
Thank you very much for touching on all those different topics. It was very comprehensive. I mean, Barzakh, we could see intergenerational trauma with children being present during all the investigations and people talking about it. And so it was very good to hear your assessment of the situation as well. We have a few minutes to open the floor for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and please note that this session is being recorded, so your voice will be recorded as well.
Hi. Ahmed, I had a question for you, touching on what Sarah was just talking about now, the intergenerational trauma. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience of working on disappearances in Chechnya and the impact on the generations since 2006.
Спасибо за вопрос. Кстати, у меня было желание немножко раскрыть вот именно вот эту часть. Я вам очень благодарен за это.
Thank you for the question. I wanted to say a few words about it, and thanks. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Вы знаете, в какой-то мере, наверное, раскрыть вот этот вопрос возможно посредством объяснения вот этого названия вот этого фильма «Barzakh».
To explain this issue, maybe I need to explain the name of the film, Barzakh.
И почему он был так назван?
Why it was called this.
Barzakh, по представлениям, значит, исламских ученых, это некий мир, который является посредством между этим миром, где мы сейчас находимся, и конечным миром, Эдемом, где мы должны пребывать.
So, according to Islamic scientists, this is the world between our world and Eden, where we are all heading to. So, this is a transition point.
То есть это мир ожидания, мир неопределенности, где пребывают наши души. То есть мы там как бы ожидаем, как бы.
This is the world of indefiniteness, uncertainty. That's where our souls are, waiting for the decision.
Вы знаете, когда мы говорили с этими людьми, которые там, у которых исчезли вот эти люди, вы знаете, у меня было всегда такое ощущение, что они как будто бы вот физически не сидят передо мной. Но на самом деле они не здесь, они в каком-то другом мире. В мире, где есть, я не знаю, там только одно представление, да, о пропавшем человеке, о пропавшем родственнике.
Really, when I spoke to people whose loved ones disappeared, I often had this strange feeling that physically they were not there, that they were somewhere else in the world where their loved ones were.
Вы знаете, вот это ощущение, да, вот, оно всегда у меня, например, присутствовало. То есть эти люди, вы знаете, самое интересное, эти люди, ты с ними говоришь, ты можешь с ними ходишь, ты можешь с ним сесть и покушать, да, но он не с тобой. Ты видишь это, что он не рядом с тобой, его мысли не рядом с тобой. Его мысли где-то вдалеке, о родственнике, о том, что он пропал, о том, что его надо найти. Было такое, что эти люди просто-напросто продавали последнее, да, там свою, я не знаю, дом, машину, да, чтобы просто в какой-то тюрьме, да, вот по каким-то слухам, чтобы проверить, есть ли их родственник там или нет.
And you could speak to those people. I've always had this feeling. You could speak to those people, you could physically touch them, you could share bread with them, but you felt that they're not with you in their thoughts, in their being. They're not with you. And all they're thinking of is the loved ones that have disappeared. And in some cases, they go as far as to sell all their belongings for the sake of confirming maybe a gossip that their loved one was in prison, detained somewhere, to confirm or maybe find out if the person was dead.
То есть эта травма, да, вот бесследного исчезновения, она просто невероятно глубокая, да, невероятно глубокая. И многие, в том числе молодые люди, да, вот как бы их судьба сложилась вот именно из-за этого, из-за пропавших, скажем, родственников, она сложилась очень-очень трагично. Это сказывается, я не знаю, там в попытках оказать сопротивление российской власти, да, отомстить, допустим, да, и так далее, так далее. То есть это очень широкая и глубокая такая травма, я считаю.
And I believe this is an enormous trauma. It's very deep, and it has impact especially on young people, and they may try to resist the authorities, or they may try to find revenge. So it really covers a lot of aspects of their lives, and it is enormous.
Психические проблемы, я не знаю, там, я не знаю, там, употребление, наверное, каких-то веществ, психотропных, наркотических и так далее. То есть это очень глубоко на самом деле.
And some people would have psychological, mental problems, or they would use substances and so on. So it's a huge problem caused by this enormous trauma.
Вы понимаете, что эти люди, в принципе, они даже не отдыхают ночью. То есть вы видели в этом фильме, да, вот там женщина говорит, я видела сон, где, значит, третья койка, и я боюсь поднять это дело, боясь, что там не будет моего сына. Кстати, сын этой женщины, Mariat, его не так давно нашли его тело, и там определили, по-моему, по ДНК, что 17-летний, кстати, 17 лет, он еще был несовершеннолетним. Его похитили ночью, и он бесследно исчез. И вот недавно буквально нашли, там обнаружили просто по ДНК, там обнаружили, что его труп.
And you can see that these people don't rest even at night. Remember the lady who was telling the story of her nightmares, how she is afraid to lift a blanket and to see that her son was not there. Now, it's been so many years, and her son was found. They found the body, and they identified him by his DNA, but it has taken a long time.
Ну вот смотрите, в 2002 году этот парень пропал с Серноводска, да, в 2002 году летом, да, буквально несколько месяцев тому назад его труп нашли. Кстати, вот эта женщина, а эти люди все о ней, да, вот эти люди все говорят, если бы мы нашли бы трупы своих людей, то нам было бы легче, это было бы как подарок для нас. Это говорили вот все, буквально все.
And this boy, he was underage, he was only 17, and he was lost in 2002, so that was so long ago, and all these people who have lost their loved ones, they kept saying, had we known that they've disappeared, that they died, had we known that they were dead, that would have been a gift for us.
То есть это очень такие, я не знаю, там продолжительные какие-то, я не знаю, какие-то душевные, физические страдания у людей. Это сравнимо только с пытками, я не знаю, вот совсем худшим в этом мире, я не знаю.
People suffer mentally and physically, and this could be compared to the worst torture in the world.
Я надеюсь, что я ответил на ваш вопрос.
I hope I had answered your question.
Thank you. We have one more question here.
Hi, спасибо. This is to Ahmed and Tetiana. Спасибо to both of you for your work and for your purpose. I wanted to ask what kind of things sustain you in your work, and what kinds of policies, campaigns, and work, including organizations, can supporters do to help you sustain that work? Thank you.
Я не знаю, в принципе, если вопрос касается мотивации, то, в принципе, я хотел бы прекратить вот такие вещи, как пытки, похищения, бесследные исчезновения. Это моя личная мотивация.
If speaking about motivation, my personal motivation is I want to stop torture, I want to stop things like that happening.
Мне об этом легче говорить, потому что я сам видел, я сам перенес эти пытки, я видел, как все это происходит. Я, в принципе, был очень близок к смерти, да. В принципе, я хотел бы, чтобы этого не было в этом мире.
It's easier for me to speak because I know what it's like. I was the one who was tortured. I was very close to death, so I want to stop it happening in the world.
Что касается поддержки, там, я не знаю, каких-то компаний, государств, тем более, да, да, они могли бы помочь, но, к сожалению, в этом мире, ну, как бы, скажем так, недостаточно поддержки, так скажем.
As for the campaigning and support from the government, yes, there may be some to help, but I would say in this world there is no support. There is not enough support.
К сожалению, очень много подчинено не правам человека в этом мире, а экономическим выгодам, да, политическим выгодам и так далее, к сожалению.
Unfortunately, it's not the human rights in this world that is a priority, but quite often it's political and economical, some other interests.
Tetiana, would you like to answer that question too, please?
Yes, my motivation is similar to Akhmed's. We do this work because we need to break the circles of impunity. And we understand that what happened in Russia, in Chechnya, this internal oppression has led to external aggression, and that this evil will multiply on the new circles. And we see that if we take an example of Ukraine, we see that lack of adequate reaction to what happened in Crimea led to aggravation of the war and more victims. And I traveled a lot throughout the last 8 years after the occupation of Crimea. In many countries, not human rights defenders, but ordinary people, they didn't know what happened in Crimea. They didn't know about these enforced disappearances. They thought that that Crimea joined Russia voluntarily, and they didn't know about this terror. They believed that referendum was conducted in appropriate way, but that was not true. Russian propaganda is very powerful, and we need to work and we need to collect and document all cases that we can. Now, the Prosecutor General Office has registered over 100,000 criminal proceedings based on the alleged war crimes committed after 24th of February. This is an avalanche of war crimes, and we understand that it's like the life of all our generation, human rights defenders, that will be spent to do our best to collect evidence and properly investigate these cases as much as we can to prevent further crimes. And in terms of what can help, I think it is very important in the cases where relatives agree to share information, to spread information about these people. And we were very happy when we got the news from people who were abducted and later liberated, and they wrote to us that because we were keeping attention to these cases, they are alive. So I think it is very important to share stories of these people who are missing, who were abducted, especially in the situation when international legal mechanisms don't work. We did submissions to different international bodies, including the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, and Russia just is ignoring all these requests. But we do believe in the strength of the ordinary people, and if they are united, and if they are sharing this information, if they demand actions from their governments, if they draw attention to these cases, we believe that it will help, if not to find and release these abducted activists, but at least to minimize the risk of application of torture and ill treatment against them.
Thank you. Yeah, we're running out of time, so I would like to wrap up this panel discussion. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It's very important for the relatives of the disappeared to know that they're not forgotten, that there are people out there who are thinking about them and trying to do their best to find out the truth of what happened to their loved ones. The work that Tetiana, Akhmed, Sarah are doing is very important, so thank you for coming here and showing your support to those affected. Thank you to the panelists for coming here. Tetiana especially joining at such a late hour. Thank you, Tetiana. Yeah.